The snow had begun to fall before sunset, but by nightfall it swept across the lonely trail in fierce white waves, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. The small girl stumbled through the storm, her thin boots sinking into drifts that reached her ankles. Her breath trembled in the freezing air. Ahead of her, a wagon creaked away into the darkness. "Please," she cried, struggling to keep pace. "Please don't leave me here." The woman seated inside the wagon did not look back. The girl ran harder. Her legs burned. Snow struck her face like needles. "Mother, please." "You are not my daughter," the woman answered coldly. "You never were." The words cut deeper than the winter wind. The wagon slowed only long enough for the woman to glance over her shoulder. Her expression carried neither anger nor guilt, only irritation. "You should be grateful I fed you this long." The girl stared at her. For years she had endured harsh words, endless chores, and cold silences. Yet some small part of her had always believed there was a limit to cruelty. Tonight she discovered there was none. The woman pointed toward the darkness beyond the trail. "Walk wherever you like. Return and I will have the gate locked." Then the driver snapped the reins. The wagon rolled away. Its lantern disappeared behind a curtain of snow. And suddenly the world became silent. The girl stood alone. She was 12 years old. She possessed no home, no family, and no destination. For a moment she simply stared into the darkness where the wagon had vanished. Not because she expected it to return, but because accepting the truth required more courage than chasing false hope. At last she lowered her gaze. Snow gathered upon her shoulders. The small bundle of belongings she carried contained almost nothing. A worn book, a wooden comb, a faded ribbon. Beneath her dress, hidden carefully against her chest, hung a silver pendant she had owned for as long as she could remember. She touched it instinctively. It was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. The wind howled through the trees. The girl pulled her cloak tighter and began walking. Hours passed. The storm grew worse. Branches creaked overhead like ancient bones. Every step became heavier than the last. She tried not to think about the warm fires she could see glowing faintly through distant farmhouse windows. Those homes belonged to strangers. Nobody would open their door for a freezing orphan wandering the roads after dark. The world had taught her that lesson many times. Eventually her feet lost feeling. Then her hands. Then her face. The cold no longer hurt. That frightened her more than the pain ever had. She knew enough about winter to understand what that meant. Still she continued forward. Because stopping meant surrender. And surrender felt too much like giving her stepmother victory. The trail curved around a dense forest. Beyond it stretched open countryside buried beneath untouched snow. The girl reached the edge of the woods and paused. A strange dizziness swept through her. The landscape blurred. She blinked. Once, twice. The horizon tilted. Her knees buckled. For several seconds she remained kneeling in the snow, fighting to stand again. But her strength had finally abandoned her. The cold trail rushed upward. Darkness swallowed everything. Several miles away, another traveler moved through the storm. A black carriage advanced steadily across the winter road, escorted by mounted riders carrying lanterns. Inside sat Duke Alexander Ashford, one of the wealthiest men in England. He stared through the frost-covered window without truly seeing the landscape beyond it. The evening gathering he had attended was already forgotten. So were the politicians, the conversations, the endless compliments. None of it mattered. Very little had mattered for years. At 38, Alexander possessed estates, influence, and more wealth than he could spend in a lifetime. Yet his vast manor remained quieter than most monasteries. His halls echoed with footsteps instead of laughter. His dining table seated dozens yet welcomed few. The Duke preferred it that way. Attachment created weakness. Loss created wounds. He had experienced enough of both. The carriage suddenly lurched. Alexander frowned. "What is it?" One of the riders approached the window. "My lord, something lies ahead." The Duke glanced outside. Snow obscured much of the road. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then a dark shape emerged beneath the lantern light. Small. Motionless. Human. Alexander opened the carriage door immediately. The wind struck him with brutal force. Ignoring it, he crossed the road. A child lay partially buried beneath fresh snow. For one terrible moment he believed she was already dead. Then he noticed the faint movement of her chest. "She's alive." The nearest rider looked surprised. "Shall we take her to the village, Your Grace?" Alexander crouched beside the unconscious girl. Snow clung to her eyelashes. Her cheeks had become pale as ivory. She appeared impossibly fragile. Yet something about her expression felt oddly stubborn, as though even unconsciousness had failed to defeat her completely. The Duke hesitated. Ordinarily he would have ordered the nearest parish to handle the matter. It would be practical, efficient, distant. Instead he found himself removing his heavy coat. He wrapped it carefully around the girl. The rider stared. Alexander rarely showed concern for anyone. The gesture felt unusual even to him. Perhaps it was because no child should be left alone in weather like this. Or perhaps it was something else he preferred not to examine. "Bring her into my carriage," he said. "My lord." "You heard me." The rider immediately obeyed. Minutes later the girl lay across the opposite seat, covered in blankets. Alexander watched silently as the carriage resumed its journey. For most of the ride she remained unconscious. Then suddenly she stirred. Her eyes opened, gray-blue, alert despite exhaustion. For several seconds she studied her surroundings without speaking. Then her gaze settled on the Duke. Neither looked away. Finally she whispered, "Am I dead?" "No." A faint pause followed. The girl considered his answer. "You seem disappointed." One corner of Alexander's mouth almost moved. "Almost." "No." She nodded slowly. "As long as we're both alive, that's good enough." The statement was unexpected. So was the calmness with which she delivered it. Most children would have cried, panicked. This one merely observed. The Duke found himself studying her more carefully. Then his gaze dropped to the silver chain visible near her collar. A sudden feeling swept through him. Recognition. Sharp and immediate. Before he could stop himself, he leaned forward. The pendant had slipped partially free, and engraved upon its surface was a crest he had not seen in nearly 13 years. The blood drained from his face, because that crest belonged to a family destroyed by scandal long ago. A family that should have left no surviving heir. Outside, the storm raged against the carriage windows. Inside, neither spoke. But for the first time in years, Duke Alexander Ashford felt something he had almost forgotten. Unease. Morning arrived beneath a veil of pale gray clouds, and the vast Ashford estate emerged from the fading storm like a fortress carved from winter itself. Marble steps gleamed beneath fresh snow. Tall windows reflected the cold light of dawn. Long rows of chimneys sent thin streams of smoke into the sky. The orphan girl stood beside one of those windows, wrapped in a borrowed wool blanket, silently observing the grounds below. She had awakened before sunrise. Old habits were difficult to abandon. For years she had learned that sleeping late invited punishment. Even now, surrounded by warmth and safety, part of her expected a harsh voice to order her back to work. Instead there was only silence. A strange, unfamiliar silence. The bedroom assigned to her was larger than the entire cottage where she had spent most of her life. A fire crackled softly within the hearth. Heavy curtains framed the windows. Polished furniture gleamed beneath candlelight. It felt less like a room and more like a dream she did not entirely trust. A knock sounded at the door. One of the housemaids entered carrying breakfast. The girl immediately stood. "You needn't rise, miss." The word startled her. Miss. Nobody had ever called her that before. The maid smiled gently before placing the tray upon a nearby table. "His Grace instructed us to ensure your comfort." The girl glanced toward the hallway. "Why?" The maid hesitated. "That is not something I can answer." After she departed, the room became quiet once more. The girl approached the tray slowly. Fresh bread. Fruit. Food prepared not out of necessity but care. For a moment she simply stared at it. Then she sat down and ate carefully, as though afraid the meal might disappear if she moved too quickly. Across the manor, Duke Alexander Ashford sat inside his private study. The room smelled faintly of old leather, candle wax, and burning oak. Stacks of documents covered his desk. Yet none of them held his attention. Instead, the silver pendant rested in his hand. Its engraved crest caught the firelight. Alexander had examined it repeatedly throughout the night. Each inspection produced the same conclusion. The crest was genuine. Impossible. Yet genuine. His gaze drifted toward the portrait hanging above the fireplace. A young nobleman stared back from the canvas. Handsome. Proud. Dead. Lord Nathaniel Hawthorne. One of Alexander's closest friends. 13 years earlier, scandal had consumed the Hawthorne family almost overnight. Their estate collapsed. Their fortunes vanished. Rumors spread through every drawing room in England. Then came tragedy. Deaths. Disappearances. Silence. The surviving child had supposedly perished shortly afterward. At least that was what society believed. Alexander lowered the pendant. For the first time he wondered whether society had been wrong. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Enter. The door opened. The orphan stepped cautiously into the study. Alexander observed her quietly. Unlike most people entering his presence, she did not appear intimidated. Curious, watchful, but not afraid. Sit. She obeyed. The chair looked enormous beneath her small frame. For several moments neither spoke. The silence stretched between them. The girl finally broke it. Am I staying? Direct. Alexander almost admired it. Temporarily. She nodded. Temporary things usually become permanent. Not always. No, she agreed. Only the important ones. The Duke studied her. Every conversation felt strangely uneven. He possessed authority, wealth, power. Yet somehow she continually forced him onto unfamiliar ground. Alexander placed the pendant upon the desk. Where did you obtain this? The girl's expression shifted instantly. Protective. It belongs to me. I know that. Then why ask? Because I wish to know how you acquired it. She hesitated. My mother gave it to me. Your mother? The one I remember. The Duke leaned forward slightly. What happened to her? The girl lowered her gaze. I don't know. The answer arrived quietly. Without self-pity. Without dramatics. Somehow that made it worse. Alexander recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone accustomed to carrying grief alone. A look he saw every morning in his own mirror. At last he dismissed the subject. For now. The girl rose from her chair. May I ask a question? You may. Why do you live alone? Alexander blinked. Few people would dare ask such a thing. Fewer still would do so without hesitation. Because I choose to. She considered that answer carefully. Then she shook her head. No. The Duke's eyebrow lifted. No. People choose things they enjoy. Her gaze moved across the study. Across the empty chairs. Across the silent room. Across the untouched second teacup resting near the fireplace. You don't enjoy it. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Alexander found himself strangely irritated. Not because she was wrong. Because she was right. You are very observant. I had to be. The answer ended the discussion. For a brief moment something passed between them. Recognition. Not friendship. Not affection. Simply understanding. Both knew what loneliness looked like. They had merely encountered it from opposite directions. Days passed. Then weeks. Winter slowly loosened its grip upon the countryside. Snow retreated from the gardens. The estate began preparing for spring. Meanwhile the orphan settled into life within Ashford Manor. She spent hours reading inside the library. She learned the names of servants. She thanked people who rarely received gratitude. Without realizing it, she gradually transformed the atmosphere around her. Even the staff noticed. Laughter occasionally returned to corridors long accustomed to silence. The Duke pretended not to notice. Yet he noticed everything. One afternoon he discovered her standing before a portrait gallery. Her attention remained fixed upon a painting of a woman holding an infant. Who is she? The girl asked. My sister. The answer escaped before he could stop it. The girl turned. Alexander rarely discussed his family. Almost never. The silence that followed felt different from previous silences. Fragile. Careful. Dangerous. What happened to her? For several seconds he said nothing. The corridor seemed unusually quiet. Finally he answered. She died. The girl looked back at the portrait. I'm sorry. No elaborate sympathy followed. No awkward comfort. Simply those two words. Then she stood beside him without speaking. Minutes passed. Neither moved. The silence became strangely peaceful. 4 years Alexander had avoided discussing his sister because every conversation brought fresh pain. Yet standing there beside the orphan he discovered something unexpected. The memory still hurt. But it no longer felt unbearable. Eventually the girl spoke. She looks kind. Alexander stared at the portrait. She was. The answer sounded softer than he intended. That evening a group of visiting aristocrats arrived for dinner. Among them were several noble women known for their sharp tongues. Conversation flowed politely until one guest glanced toward the orphan seated at the far end of the table. A curious arrangement, Your Grace. The room quieted. Another woman smiled faintly. I confess, I had assumed orphanages existed for such purposes. A few guests chuckled. The girl lowered her eyes but remained composed. Alexander set down his glass. The sound echoed through the room. Instant silence followed. If orphanages possessed her intelligence, he said calmly, Parliament would function far more efficiently. No laughter followed. Only embarrassment. The noblewomen immediately fell silent. The conversation shifted elsewhere. Yet the damage had already been reversed. For the first time in her life, someone powerful had defended her publicly. The girl glanced toward the Duke. Their eyes met briefly. Neither acknowledged the moment, but both remembered it. Later that night, long after the guests departed, Alexander sat alone inside his study. A letter lay open upon his desk. The contents had arrived from an investigator earlier that evening. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then again. Then a third time. Each reading confirmed the same shocking possibility. The orphan stepmother had lied about nearly everything. And buried within decades of forgotten records was evidence suggesting the impossible. The girl sleeping beneath his roof was not merely abandoned. She might be the last surviving heir of the Hawthorne family. And if that proved true, powerful people would have reasons to fear her existence. Spring arrived at last, washing the countryside in pale gold sunlight and soft green growth, yet Ashford Manor remained unusually tense. Beneath its elegant exterior, preparations were unfolding with quiet precision. For nearly 3 months, Duke Alexander Ashford had investigated every fragment of the orphan girl's past. Records had been uncovered. Witnesses had been found. Old letters hidden for years had resurfaced. Piece by piece, the truth emerged from beneath layers of deception. And the truth was extraordinary. The child abandoned on a frozen road was not an orphan by birth. She was Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, the last surviving heir of one of England's oldest noble families. For 13 years, a carefully constructed lie had hidden her existence. The woman she believed to be her stepmother had stolen documents, forged records, and spread false reports of the child's death. By erasing Eleanor from society, she had gained access to money and property that never belonged to her. The scheme had succeeded for over a decade. Now it was beginning to collapse. The revelation should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Alexander found himself troubled. Not because of the evidence. Because of Eleanor. The title changed nothing about her. She remained the same observant girl who thanked servants by name. The same child who spent evenings reading beside fireplaces. The same stubborn soul who refused self-pity. Yet soon society would descend upon her. Society rarely forgave weakness. And it never forgave scandal. One evening, as candlelight flickered inside the library, Eleanor sat reading near the hearth when Alexander entered. She immediately noticed the seriousness in his expression. What happened? The Duke stood beside the fireplace. There is something you should know. The book slowly closed in her lap. For the next several minutes he explained everything. The Hawthorne family. The investigation. The forged records. The inheritance. The stolen identity. Throughout the entire conversation, Eleanor remained remarkably still. When he finished, silence settled between them. Finally she asked, "So my mother never abandoned me?" "No." The answer came immediately. Firmly. Certain. Something trembled briefly behind her eyes. Not tears. Relief. For years she had carried the hidden fear that her own mother had willingly left her behind. Now that burden vanished. She lowered her gaze. For a moment she appeared younger than her years. Then she looked back up. What happens now? Alexander studied her. That depends on you. She considered the answer carefully. Then surprised him. I don't care about the inheritance. The Duke blinked. You do not. No. She stared into the fire. I spent 12 years wanting one thing. What? A family. The words landed harder than any accusation. Neither spoke afterward. Because neither trusted themselves to do so. The following weeks brought preparations for a grand spring ball held annually at Ashford Manor. The event attracted some of the most influential figures in England. Nobles, politicians, landowners, families whose names stretched across centuries. This year, however, Alexander had another purpose. He intended to reveal the truth. Publicly. Completely. No rumors. No private settlements. No quiet arrangements. The lie that had stolen Eleanor's life would end before witnesses. News of the upcoming gathering spread rapidly through society. So did speculation. Many guests wondered why the Duke had become increasingly protective of the mysterious orphan. Others assumed some hidden scandal would emerge. Few guessed the truth. Among those attending would be the woman responsible for everything. Eleanor's stepmother. Confident. Arrogant. Entirely unaware that her carefully constructed world stood upon the edge of collapse. The evening of the ball arrived beneath clear skies. Hundreds of lanterns illuminated the manor. Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand ballroom in golden light. Music drifted through marble corridors. Silk gowns shimmered. Jewels sparkled. Whispers filled every corner of the room. Alexander stood near the entrance greeting guests. Calm, composed, controlled. Yet beneath the surface, tension remained. Not for himself. For Eleanor. At last the moment arrived. A servant approached. "She is ready, Your Grace." Alexander nodded. The ballroom doors opened. Conversation gradually faded. Heads turned. Then silence swept through the room. Eleanor entered alone. Gone were the worn dresses. Gone were the signs of hardship. She wore a beautiful ivory gown that reflected candlelight like moonlit snow. Her posture remained graceful. Her expression remained steady. Most importantly, nothing about her dignity appeared borrowed. She looked exactly as she should have looked all along. Like a hawthorn. The crowd stared. Whispers erupted immediately. The stepmother's face paled. Confusion replaced confidence. Eleanor crossed the ballroom calmly. She stopped beside Alexander. The Duke offered his arm. Without hesitation she accepted it. The gesture itself transformed the room. Because everyone present understood what it meant. Alexander Ashford did nothing casually. If he stood beside someone publicly, he did so deliberately. The music ceased. The Duke stepped forward. His voice carried effortlessly across the ballroom. "Tonight, I wish to correct an injustice." Silence deepened. He presented evidence. Letters. Witness statements. Official records. Years of deception unfolded piece by piece. No shouting accompanied the revelations. No theatrical accusations. Only facts. Clear. Precise. Unavoidable. The stepmother attempted denial. At first. Then excuses. Then blame. Each defense collapsed beneath the weight of truth. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Power shifted visibly through the room. 4 years society had treated Eleanor as worthless. Now those same people discovered they had been deceived. The woman who abandoned a child stood exposed. The child herself stood taller with every revelation. Finally the Duke turned toward Eleanor. For a moment neither spoke. The ballroom waited. Alexander rarely displayed emotion publicly. Yet tonight something changed. Perhaps because the frightened child he found in the snow no longer stood before him. Instead he saw courage, resilience, strength, a heart that hardship had failed to corrupt. He addressed the crowd. Lady Eleanor Hawthorne was robbed of her name. Silence. She was robbed of her inheritance. Silence. She was robbed of her place in society. The room remained utterly still. Then his voice softened slightly. But she will never again be robbed of her family. For the first time all evening, emotion appeared upon Eleanor's face. Small, fragile, real. Alexander extended his hand. She took it. The gesture felt simple. Yet its meaning carried enormous weight. "I formally acknowledge Lady Eleanor Hawthorne as my adopted daughter." Gasps spread throughout the ballroom. The Duke continued. "From this day forward, she stands under my protection, carries my support, and possesses a home within Ashford Manor for as long as she desires it." Eleanor's eyes glistened. Not from sadness. From something she had almost stopped believing existed. Belonging. The ballroom erupted into applause. Not forced. Not polite. Genuine. Many guests rose to their feet. Others bowed their heads respectfully. The humiliation that once defined her life dissolved beneath public recognition. At last the crowd saw her clearly. Not as an orphan. Not as a burden. Not as a scandal. As herself. Later, after the celebration ended and guests gradually departed, Alexander and Eleanor stood alone inside the grand ballroom. Moonlight filtered through towering windows. The chandeliers glowed softly overhead. The marble floor reflected silver light. For several minutes they simply stood there. Neither wished to break the quiet. Finally Eleanor spoke. "You stopped on that road." Alexander looked toward her. "Yes. You could have kept going." He considered the statement. Then shook his head. "No." The answer was simple. Certain. For the first time since his sister's death, the vast emptiness within Ashford Manor no longer felt quite so empty. Eleanor smiled softly. And together they walked across the silent ballroom beneath the fading candlelight, leaving behind the shadows of abandonment and stepping into a future neither of them had expected to find. V.